Hello, my name's Gerald Elias, and I'm the violinist in a very special recording project. Along with harpsichord player Pamela Palmer-Jones and cellist Noriko Kishi, we're going to be making the first recording ever of a dozen violin sonatas that were written over 300 years ago by the composer-violinist Pietro Castrucci. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Castrucci. As music director of Vivaldi by Candlelight in Salt Lake City, every year I try to look for undiscovered or obscure Baroque composers that most people have never heard of, like Porta or Latilla or Brescianello. But my favorite so far is Pietro Castrucci, who lived from 1678 to 1752. And one of the reasons I like him a lot is that, like me, he was an orchestra player. He was the concert master of an opera orchestra conducted by none other than George Frederick Handel. And he was also good friends with a fellow countryman, Francesco Gimignani, who was quite a famous violinist and composer in his own right. When I first discovered these sonatas, I found them in the original edition from 1718, and as far as I know, that's the only edition that has ever been made. So that's what we're performing from, and it's quite a journey of discovery to interpret the music of that era from the original scores. We've managed to spend hours and hours rehearsing and recording the music of Castrucci. And the more we play it, the more we're impressed and excited by this incredible music. He was a contemporary of Handel, as I mentioned, and of his teacher, Corelli, of Vivaldi, and Gimignani, and many other great composers. Yet Castrucci's music is quite unique. He has his own expressive voice, which is very dramatic and almost storytelling in its manner. And every one of the 12 sonatas that we're playing tells quite a bit of a different story. So when we perform it, we really try to bring out the expressive qualities of each individual sonata. Now, one of the things about Baroque playing is that these days there's been a movement to perform this period of music, which is about around the year 1700 to 1750, more or less, on original instruments, using various kinds of changes from the way we, quote, normally play music today. And as you've been watching this, you probably noticed this violin bow looks quite a bit different than what you're used to seeing. This is a replica of a Baroque bow. It was made recently, but it has all the characteristics of a Baroque bow. So that's one difference. Another difference is that unlike the usual tuning for string instruments today, which is for an A at 440, back in those days, the most common pitch for an A was 415, which is almost a half step lower than what we're used to. The final major change is that you probably can't see, but I am using gut strings. These lower strings are gut strings that are wound in metal, but this E string is a pure gut string, and that takes getting used to. I've been spending months trying to adapt to these three different parameters of Baroque playing. And the more I get into it, the more I realize how unified it is when you do all those things. Now, there's also such a thing as a Baroque violin, which has somewhat different dimensions than what I have here. This is actually a modern violin, and I'm proud to say it was made for me by my son Jacob last year, who is a new violin maker. It's a beautiful sounding instrument, and I've adapted it to sound like a Baroque instrument as best I can. So putting all those things together, I'm working with Nori, the cellist, who is playing in the Baroque style, and Pam, who is playing on a harpsichord. And our effort is to create not only the Baroque sound, but the whole Baroque aesthetic by making the music lively, dramatic, and passionate.
Playing with Baroque bows, gut strings, and at a lower Baroque pitch puts both the performer and also the listener into a completely different kind of a soundscape and provides for a much more intimate and expressive sonic experience for everyone. The music becomes more personal and inwardly emotional. As performers, this is a different experience for us as we are used to playing on our modern, much louder instruments such as violins with higher tension steel strings or a 9-foot concert grand Steinway that helps us project the sound out into a large concert hall. But most venues 300 years ago were much, much smaller. Since around the turn of the 20th century, pianos have been tuned using a system that we call equal temperament, which means that the actual pitch distances between all of the notes is equal. This allows keyboards to play music in any key, but since this is an alteration to the fundamental laws of acoustics, the sound of this temperament sounds safe, but rather bland. Since most of us have grown up hearing this temperament, we are used to it, and we don't really notice the difference. But composers and performers of the past were very well aware that there were many more color possibilities with using tuning systems that are tuned to a specific key following the laws of acoustics and overtones, which provide for a more resonant, ringing sound overall, but with some chords that howl more than others. Harpsichordists call this howling the wolf effect, and composers exploited these characteristics to add more spice to their compositions. For our performance of Castrucci's Opus 1 sonatas, we have chosen to use a Volati temperament. Harpsichordists of the past were not only trained in performance, but also were well trained in the art of composition and improvisation as well. In Baroque-era music, keyboard players were provided with a bass line with numerical chord symbols or figures and created apart from that information, just like a jazz keyboard player nowadays would read a lead sheet with chord symbols on it. Here's the first page of the Castrucci Sonata No. 1. The keyboard player would play the bass line and improvise a part using the numbers and other symbols to create a proper harmony. Over the past 300+ years since these sonatas were written, our system of music notation has evolved, and the meaning of notational symbols has changed over time. So for me personally, the biggest obstacle with learning this piece had to do with the readability issue with the hand-drawn as opposed to a typeset published score. I tried several different experiments, such as trying to jot down some ideas in a closed position, or rewriting the figured bass numbers underneath the bass line instead of on top, or adding a staff in the middle, teaching myself to write in the style of the original scribe so that everything looked uniform, and I eventually came up with something that was easier for me to read. So what you see are simply ideas that I liked of how this part could be realized, but yet allows for the flexibility for it to be different every time according to the mood of the players at that very moment.